Okay, we're going to get started, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Colin McStravick at Minimize, and we're hosting our first ever webinar. Can't believe I'm doing this. So
Yay.
it's, bear with us as we kind of learn the ropes here, and format's going to be going. We're just going to have a little chat today. I'd like to get started by introducing Bette Hannon, as you can see over here. Bette Hannon is an accessibility expert, website accessibility expert, I should say. Bette and I were introduced through another service company called Termageddon, and some of you have already been involved with Termageddon, and we've already set up your websites with their service. Termageddon is a privacy policy code generator. Great service, really good value for your money, and we can talk about that later. But I had a client, that I was talking to them about Termageddon services, and this client also was interested in accessibility for their website. And I was scratching my head. I'm like, I've heard about this, and I think this is important, but I need a little bit. I need some, an expert really to kind of show us the ropes and show us some ideas about how to get started about incorporating accessibility into the websites we build, and also potentially, fixing some of the websites we built, many years ago before this was really a focus. The folks at Termageddon highly recommended Bette Hannon, and they said she's a great person to work with, really friendly. Can't go wrong talking to her. So I reached out to her, and sure enough, they were right. She's just been a great pleasure to work with. Real professional, just real down to earth kind of person, who is also very sharp and knows her stuff.
Oh, you're making me blush now.
Hey, I try to give credit where credit's due. So here we are. Bette and I started initial chats about how we could potentially work together, about how she could potentially offer some of her accessibility knowledge to Minimize customers. And we have been working together actively on a couple of projects, actually, where we've gone in and started doing some remediation for accessibility purposes. So with that being said, does that sound like a good intro as to how
that sounds good?
Okay.
It's not my first webinar, so I'll tell you that. So
okay.
we're okay. We're okay.
Okay.
So I'm gonna start sharing my screen, and then I'm gonna pull that over to that side. Can you see my big presentation now?
I do. And hey, before we get started, the only house rule we have here today that Bette and I were talking about is we're gonna, give this presentation on website accessibility. Bette is gonna talk you through, kind of a quick deck here about reasons why this is important. However, we're gonna try to keep, if you've been in webinars before, we've got the chat room open here on the Zoom. If you have any questions, just pop them in the chat. And then toward the end of the presentation, I'll kind of go through and pick out the ones that seem most relevant. And we'll talk about, bring those questions up and talk about that. So, and then at the very end, we'll open it up to anybody. So
yeah, we'll definitely have lots of time for questions. That's fine.
So
cool.
With that, again, a couple people have just joined in. I'm going to just recap just a little bit. I'm going to introduce you to Bette Hannon, an accessibility professional specialist, and she's going to talk through real quickly just some reasons why accessibility is important for websites these days.
Great. All right.
Thank you.
So just a little, thanks, Colin. It was a great introduction. So just a little bit more about me. I've been a WordPress user since 2008, and I've helped develop over 150 websites, run a small agency. I'm based out of Bend, Oregon, and I know some of you are West Coast people and some are not, Midwest folks. And we do a lot of work with accessibility and gravity forms. So those are my two big passions within WordPress. And there's my Twitter handle if you wanted to reach out on Twitter. If you think of something after the fact, feel free to reach out. So everybody has an accessibility story. Colin was telling just a little bit of his in terms of how he came to sort of start thinking about website accessibility. About 6 years ago now, one of our still existing clients, a large California water district that's actually a part of the California.gov website structure, let us know that they had become aware that there were some newer laws that were going to be applying to them to require them to have a certain level of website accessibility. And they asked us to help them with that. We tried to refer them out to others. We actually did bring in some specialists too, just like this, right? And we didn't know a lot about it then, but the client really wanted us to be able to support them in an ongoing way. So we all of our team and the client dove in, and we learned a lot about website accessibility. And when we did, our team got really hooked and passionate about making the internet as widely available as possible, and including people with disabilities. And when you see what website accessibility can do in terms of the human dignity of people with disabilities, that's a big part of that. And that's part of why I do these talks for other agencies, just really to help people learn more about accessibility. Because I think when you know more about accessibility, then you can continue to make it work for your website. I am not the most technical person on our team, and my focus in this talk is really more about why we should make our websites accessible, a little bit about what accessibility is. So a lot of people start their journey with accessibility with wanting to avoid a lawsuit. And this chart shows the number of website accessibility lawsuits over the last few years. As you can see, they've been dramatically rising. In 2021, it's not on this chart, but in 2029, that number was just under 3,000. So these lawsuits are brought under the Americans with Disabilities, or ADA Act. That act offers legal protections for people with disabilities. It is not entirely clear yet how the ADA relates to websites, since ADA was signed in 1990, before the internet was really such a commonplace thing in all of our lives. And there are still some gray areas in terms of accessibility and what makes something accessible. A lot of that depends on context. And so adding all of that together with, when ADA first came out, the Department of Justice, U.S. Department of Justice, came out with some strict, fairly clear guidelines. You need a ramp, and it needs to be at this angle. And both administrations in both parties have not had DOJ come out with those sort of specific guidelines. And so in the U.S., what's left to us are essentially lawsuits. That's the way we in the U.S. solve this. In Europe, they take a little bit different tack. But for us, we end up having these lawsuits to try and figure out where those guidelines are and what the requirements are and what makes things accessible and not accessible. Some of these lawsuits are more predatory, where a single law firm and a single plaintiff, usually it's a blind person, will sue multiple website owners. And so we talk about these sites that can be predatory. That does not mean that they lack legal standing. It just means it's a little icky about how they're putting it together. So maybe you have heard about the Domino's Pizza case that there was a Supreme Court ruling that related to that, or a suit filed against Beyonce's fan site or some other sites. The threat of those lawsuits is very real. Increasingly, the verdicts come down on the side of the disabled person, and they require that the sites be made accessible. So even if your suit is settled out of court, the costs for attorneys can be significant, and then you still have to make your website accessible. And I really don't like to fuel this fear mongering. There are a lot of, when we're talking about website accessibility, there are a lot of ways that people try to, ramp up your fear about getting sued. And I think beyond a lawsuit, there are a lot of better business building, business positive ways to make your website accessible. But if it's the fear of an expensive lawsuit that motivates you to commit to accessibility, then I'm okay with that. And actually, avoiding a lawsuit is probably the biggest ROI factor on the cost of making your website accessible. So let's talk a little bit about what is website accessibility? When I go to networking events and I introduce myself and I say, well, my agency specializes in website accessibility, you can almost see this little cartoon thought bubble of confusion over people's heads. And that thought bubble has a website on one part of it and somebody in a wheelchair on the other side, and a confusion about why people in wheelchairs might need help surfing websites. So I think understanding what website accessibility is can help you conquer your fears about it and be more committed to it. So let's talk more about website accessibility. The big picture is that there are a significant number of people with a permanent or temporary disability that means that they cannot use the web, either desktop or mobile, in the same way that the majority of people do. So a temporary disability, and actually more accurately, we would say a temporary impairment, might be that I've broken my hand and I can't use it for mousing. In the US, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, estimates that around 25% of all US adults have a permanent or temporary disability. That's pretty common in most industrialized nations around the world, 20 to 25%. That's 1 in 4 or 5 people. And it's a surprising number for a lot of people who are beginning to think about website accessibility. I think sometimes people think, well, I know one blind person or one person in a wheelchair of all the people I know, so it's really a very small number. But we're not talking just about people who are blind or who have a mobility impairment. We're also talking about people who simply have diminishing vision, people who have color blindness, people who have reading disabilities. And if you start thinking about it, a lot of these disabilities are really more invisible. So it's actually a fairly significant chunk of people. And of course, the number of disabilities increases as we age. I'm over 50 and I'm starting to do that little, that thing about how small is the print. So we're talking about a good chunk of people. Website accessibility gives people, really, this is the definition, gives people with diverse abilities equal access, equal opportunity to access and use web content. That's all it is. It's really making your website usable by everybody, including people with disabilities. So let's look at some examples. So if you are a person who has severe visual disabilities and maybe even total blindness, there are tools like screen readers that will read out loud to you the content that is on a web page, if that content is formatted properly. One of the older screen reader technologies is JAWS, and the license for a JAWS might cost you $1,000 a year. It's not cheap to have disabilities. A newer screen reader is NVDA, Non-Visual Display Access, which is open source. That means free. You can go to the NVDA website. You can download that software. You can put it on your computer. You can try it out. I want you to be aware that when you try it out, you will probably use that tool differently than someone who is actually needing to use the tool. You might want to just go to YouTube and search for people demoing screen readers so you can see how a person uses a screen reader. It can be quite life-changing to realize how this opens up the web for people with visual disabilities or who need screen readers. And by the way, it's not just people who are blind or visually impaired who use screen readers. There are some people who have traumatic brain injuries or who have had their ability to read impaired, but not other parts of their brain. Or who have reading disabilities, often use screen readers because it's easier for them to take in information when it's read to them rather than reading it. So all kinds of people use screen readers. This is one kind of accessibility technology that you would want to look at. If you're not able to use a mouse with your hands, there are adaptive devices that allow you to use websites. Stephen Hawking had a sensor on his sat off of his glasses, and he was able to trigger that sensor with a muscle in his cheek, and that allowed him to navigate the web. If your website is formatted properly, it can be navigated in this way. And there are thousands of different devices. They are very, very tailored to a person's specific disabilities. They are, there are sip and puff devices. There are eye tracking devices. But all of these devices, you don't really have to worry about thousands of devices. They all come back to being keyboard driven. In other words, that sensor on Stephen Hawking's glasses was really just pressing the tab key or the enter key on his computer. And so you can begin to test the keyboard navigation ability of your website by just visiting your website, reload the page, and then start using your tab and enter keys to try and navigate through your site. So those are kind of ways that people are using a couple of technologies. And the thing to remember is your website has to be formatted properly for those devices to be able to work. It's not just about formatting them for the devices, but also some of the other pieces. So let's talk about what some of those kinds of changes to your site look like. Huge pieces of that properly formatted part have to do with semantic markup. And really that just means that your page is organized with the code tags properly. So you can see on the left side, there are things called H tags, and that stands for heading tags. So the H1 on your web page is always the page title. And then the H2s and 3s and 4s down to H6s and beyond, if you have them, really kind of function kind of like an outline of a high school essay, right? The Roman numeral 1, and then the capital letter A, and then the small Roman numerals, and they kind of nest inside themselves. And so, for instance, if you make sure that on your website, when you're working in WordPress, H1 is always the page title. So you'll start, your first one would be an H2, and you'll want to label those, and they really are the kind of, one sentence at most kind of labels down the page that let not only people who are using accessibility devices, but they let people scan your page more properly. They go through. Now, semantic markup includes other things, other tags in the key, but H tags are kind of one of the big important ones for when content is being put into the website to pay attention to. The other piece of content that you want to pay attention to is that the images of your website have what are called alt text. Alt text is what that screen reader user uses to describe the image. So you have a little in the code, you'll see the alt equals, and then that in the quotes, that's what the screen reader will read out loud. So you want to make sure that that alt text is not, image 5679.jpg or photo. You never need to put into the alt text that it's an image of, because the screen reader reads that out loud. Image, alt, and then it tells this, women playing with 2 children in the sand at the beach. So that's what you want to do in terms of those 2 things. I have seen people talk about these 2 issues make up about 80% of all website accessibility issues. Think about that. 80%. If you can deal with these 2 things site-wide on your site, you will have gone a long way toward making your site accessible. Now, there are other types of disabilities and accommodations that are required, and we talked about visual and mobility disabilities. Those are just 2. Some other things that we would need to think about are addressing color blindness. So making a good contrast between the color of a font and its background. The needs of people who are deaf if you're using videos. You want to make sure that you don't have any flashing items that could induce a seizure for people who have seizures. And you want to make sure that you're not making your text full justification, where it's lined up on both the left and right side. That creates what are called rivers of white for people with reading disabilities. They have a very difficult time with full justification as opposed to just left justifying. And there are tons of other presentations from places about accessibility. And if you just search around on YouTube, you can find some examples and more technical pieces around accessibility. I want to talk briefly, just quickly, also about another piece, and that this is the color contrast. This is another really common accessibility issue for a lot of websites, and it has to do with the contrast between the color of the font and the background behind it. So you can see just by this graphic that there are some of these that are just really hard to read. And this, of course, increases as people age, right? The difficulty increases. And so, especially if your demographic of people who are coming to your website is people who are over 50, you want to make sure that you're especially dealing with color contrast. One of my favorite color, and there are a lot of fairly simple online testers to determine whether you're meeting guidelines. One of my favorite ones is that link below, the webaim.org. They have a number of tools that you can use, but their color contrast checker that's online, and you just put in the code for the font color and the code for the background color, and it tells you exactly whether you're meeting the guidelines. So the fullest place to go for all the information about the guidelines that I've been talking about is called the WCAG, or WCAG, the Website Content Accessibility Guidelines. They come in 3 levels: single A, double A, triple A. Double A is the most common focus of effort, and where you need to go to start learning more about the implementations. You can go to Ally Project. There's a checklist, and that's a helpful way to begin to think about a checklist for your website. So briefly, I want to just give a little PSA here about overlay plugins. So an overlay plugin for WordPress and accessibility uses a plugin that uses a bit of AI, or artificial intelligence, and a bit of code on your site to try and fix on the fly any accessibility issues. And you might have heard some of the brand names of Accessibee or Userway, but AI is only able to detect about 30% of accessibility issues. Some of the ones that we talked about, so they're the most common ones, things like color contrast and whether you have alt text. But that AI can often give false negatives and false positives. So for instance, the AI can tell you whether you have alt text, but it can't tell you whether it's good alt text or compliant alt text, right? If your alt text is the JPEG or just says photo, that's not compliant. You have alt text, but it's not, it's not meeting the standard, right? So at the outset, these overlay plugins are only going to cover a portion of the accessibility issues on your website. Now, that's certainly not the impression that you would get from the advertising around these plugins. They have gotten huge amounts of venture capital, and the sales pitches that are coming out from the overlay companies and from affiliate agencies that are getting a commission for selling that service, they try to give you the impression that simply by installing a line of code that all your accessibility issues will magically disappear, and that it's sort of a quick, easy button for making your site compliant. And that's just not true. In my opinion, it's sort of a bit of snake oil sales going on. These plugins also usually offer some sort of accessibility tools, like magnifiers and color changes for people who are colorblind, in a little widget on the site. But in actuality, if a person needs tools like that, they already have them on their computer, because 99% of other websites don't have any kind of little tools like that. And what can happen then is those tools, 2 sets of tools, conflict with one another and leave neither one of them to work properly. So a lot of people with disabilities have publicly admitted that they block as many of the IP addresses for those tools as they can, so that they don't have to deal with the overlay tools that businesses are installing on their site. So think about that. You're paying, a chunk of money every month for that service, that the people who it's purported to help are blocking, that don't want to deal with. Additionally, we are starting to see some anecdotal evidence that predatory lawsuit attorneys are targeting sites using these overlay plugins because they know the site will still have accessibility issues because it can't cover everything. And they can prove that you knew you should have been doing something for accessibility because you installed the overlay, and know that if you get sued, the overlay plugin is not going to stand by you in court. And increasingly, the ADA lawsuits that have been settled are mandating that you remove the overlay plugin and fix the underlying accessibility issues. So my best advice is spend the money that you might have spent on that easy solution by making your website accessible so you don't need it. So that's been about what accessibility is. Let's start talking about the whys, why you would want to make your website accessible. Think about how much of our world today involves the internet and websites, banking and payments, setting up appointments, managing services like utilities. Website accessibility is what enables people with disabilities to live independently, with human dignity, without having to depend on family members or friends or even total strangers for the most basic help in accessing content and services. Accessibility really is the right thing to do. There's a moral case for accessibility. It's, in my view, it's a do unto others as they, you would have them do unto you, right? Be what you would like the world to see. And I don't want to suggest that we not keep making that moral case for accessibility. We do need to do that. But the reality is that when the competing interests of time and money come into play for a lot of businesses, and it does take more time and more money to make and keep websites accessible. We haven't even talked about keeping sites accessible. Not everybody's swayed by this moral argument. So we do need to start talking more about the wider benefits for accessibility, about how making your website accessible and keeping it accessible is good for your business and good for the bottom line. So what are the advantages to making your website more accessible? There are services out there where you will pay, and sometimes not small amounts of money, to try and increase the traffic to your website by 5%. Increasing the audience to your website by 5% would be amazing. But if somewhere around 20 to 25% of adults need some sort of accommodation, why would you not want to increase your potential audience by 25%? People with disabilities have money to spend just like everyone else. You want to make it easy and desirable for them to spend it with you. And maybe this is a little different for architects, I don't know, and other business sites, but I sometimes do this presentation with folks who are selling products, and I would say, well, don't let the argument that people with disabilities can't use your product derail you, because even if you sell hunting scopes, George, who's legally blind, might not be your primary customer, but why would you want to prevent them from researching and buying your scopes for a family member? And so you're wanting to expand that. And actually, I learned later that there are hunting scopes for people who are blind and involving a sighter for you. So, even my examples sometimes are limited, but you can increase your potential audience by making your website accessible. One of the most basic web accessibility tasks is adding alt text to your images, like I described before, and that's the text that the screen reader reads out loud. But alt text is also what the search engine Google bots index to know what your image is and to help decide how relevant your content is for specific searches. Screen readers and assistive devices need that proper semantic markup with the heading tags, but Google and the bots also use that to sort and assess your content. All of that helps with SEO. So when you add alt text and you use your heading tags properly and proper semantic markup, you make your website more accessible and you give Google more to work with and you boost your SEO. It's a win-win all around. You've no doubt seen curb cuts like this. These are put into sidewalks to enable access for people who use wheelchairs and mobility carts and walkers. And absolutely, they help people who use wheelchairs and those other devices. But I'm really glad when to see curb cuts like that when I'm hauling my luggage around, or people who push kids in strollers are happy for curb cuts. And when you make your website accessible, you'll start to look at things like how many clicks does it take to get to information? Do the colors have enough contrast for good visibility? And everyone will have an improved user experience on your website, just like with curb cuts. So consider, for example, that some people will not have a disability or an impairment, but they have a contextual limitation. So maybe I'm trying to use your website while I'm holding a wiggly baby, or I'm on my phone in bright sunlight. An accessible website is easier for those people to use as well. And when people find your website easier to use, they stay on it longer, they enjoy the experience more, you increase the chances that they'll convert into customers or clients. I like to call this the curb cut effect. Let website accessibility make your site better for everybody. And by the way, lots of accommodations and technologies that were originally developed for assisting people with disabilities have spilled over into the mainstream to make all our lives easier. All of the AI assistants like Alexa and Google Home and all of those started as ways that AI could help people with various disabilities. And now we all get to the benefit with them. So make your site accessible, improve everybody's user experience. It's usually a lot cheaper to keep current clients or customers than to acquire new ones. I'm actually, now that I'm saying that, I'm not sure that that's true for architectural firms. Maybe those are usually one big project and then they're done, but maybe people come back again and again. But the likelihood of developing disability increases as we age. So difficulties can start small, reading the small print, not seeing the good color contrasts. And so smart businesses want to keep customers, even as they might develop disabilities, and make those websites accessible as an investment in retaining customers. So if your website it has interactions on it, you definitely, even something as simple as filling out a contact form, you want to make sure that those functions are as accessible as possible. And by the way, that the same can be said for employees. If you use a web or computer-based system for employment applications or for performing work, you'll want to make sure that there's an investment in your employees or potential employees by making those accessible. We usually like to feel good about the brands that we associate with. And experts call this belief-driven buyers. We want to shop at local shops that invest in our local community, and we want to turn away from brands if we discover they're using sweatshops. There's a researcher named Dan Edelman in this area who estimates that 64%, that nearly two-thirds of all consumers around the world will either buy or boycott a brand solely because of its position on a social or political issue. So making your website accessible and then not hesitating to make that known broadcasts your company's values about inclusion and making positive differences in the world. And that can be a significant investment in promoting your brand. And this is attractive not just to people with disabilities. When I have a family member or a friend or a loved one who's affected by a disability, then I pay attention to whether they're included or excluded. We have people, there are people who really, as a base value, want to make the world a more inclusive place. They care about making the world a welcoming place for people who are minorities or have disabilities. They care about human dignity and being able to live independently. And when I have a choice between a company that supports the independence of my blind friend versus one that doesn't, all things being equal, I choose the brand that values my friend. A few years back, I invited a blind contractor to work with us on a project, and I asked her to schedule using my Calendly link. And she had to come back and tell me that she was unable to use it because it wasn't accessible. And so I contacted Calendly, and I learned that they had already received this concern and they were already working on some accommodation, some accessibility work. And within a few months, they were making that, it's not perfect, right? But they've made it more accessible. It's usable now. But if they hadn't responded, or if essentially they had said, no, if they required a blind person to get assistance from a family member to schedule anything, or just revert back to using email, emailing back and forth with me, I probably would have found another solution. I would have moved on because I care about those things, right? So making an investment in your brand. When you invest in your brand in that way, the way that you make that known is by putting an accessibility statement on your website. So usually you put a statement at the footer of your site. Doesn't have to be huge or front and center. This is the one from our own website. It's just only in the footer like this, just right next to the privacy policy from Termageddon. And generally, privacy policies have three parts. An opening statement that says something like, we want everybody to be able to enjoy this site and use this site. And then two, we have some commitment to WCAG, or at least some acknowledgement that you've tried to specifically make the site accessible for people with disabilities. And then three, some acknowledgement that keeping a website accessible is an ongoing work, and people may encounter problems, and you invite them to contact you about accessibility issues. And of course, you have to take seriously any issues that people contact you about. So just kind of a review all the reasons for accessibility: increasing your potential audience, improving SEO, improving user experience, investing in your customers, and investing in your brand. So let's talk a little bit about some resources that are out there. The IRS offers disabled access credit. This is actually was first offered to business owners in the 90s after ADA was passed. It was originally intended to be for store owners, business front owners, to be able to make their businesses more accessible under ADA. But it carries over for people doing digital access. So you can get up to a 50% tax credit. This is a non-refundable tax credit, so it just reduces what you owe. It doesn't get you any refund back, to make your website, making your website accessible, or doing anything to improve the accessibility of the site. So the business has to be under 30 employees or under $1 million in gross revenue, one of the two. But things like the entire cost of a website project, when accessibility is the focus of the project, can be deducted. So not just the accessibility portions, but the entire website project, if that includes accessibility. It includes things like accessibility audits, remediation work on the site. Now, you might not be able to see much of it because it's teeny tiny little print there, but that's the entire form right there on the right. It's very short. So you need to just make sure you get the invoice or the receipt that you get when you pay out for this work, and there's a minimum of $250 expenditure, but the receipt actually says indicates that it included accessibility as a part of the work, and you can make that claim. So people are getting that tax credit. Another resource is that there are, at least for now, there's at least one company offering businesses insurance against ADA website lawsuits. Now, more companies will likely surface, more of these policies will likely surface. I'm a little ambivalent about whether this is a good expenditure. You can get up to $50,000 in coverage for $1,000 a year. They do try to work with you on helping you get more compliant. So you start out at a lower coverage level, and then as you meet some of the standards, they increase the amount that they will cover. But it is there, and people do use it, and so I would be remiss if I didn't share it with you. I think if you spent $1,000 a year working to keep your site accessible, it might be a better expenditure. And then finally, another resource that you can do is you can do an audit of your website, an accessibility audit. And so this is an in-depth testing of your website to find and create a report about any of the accessibility issues that are found. So we talked before about artificial intelligence, AI, only finding a portion of the accessibility issues. there are agencies out there that will do automated only audits, and typically these are fairly low cost or free. So I just want to warn you that you want to watch out for this. They're not really getting you the kind of information you need to be sure your site is really compliant. So for instance, automated audits can they can tell you whether you have alt text or not, but whether that alt text is good or not. They can't tell you whether your site has keyboard navigation issues because that has to be checked manually, right? So there are some things that can only be checked manually. So what you want to do is you want to look for audits that have human testing as a part of them. But you know those tests don't have to necessarily be done by disabled people. So typically, folks will use automated testing for looking at things like color contrast and are there alt text, right? But they'll also do manual testing, just like a disabled person would try to use your website, right? We are in our agency, our non-disabled developers do 99% of this work. They visit the website and they start trying to look for keyboard navigation issues. When we find something that we aren't sure about, then we bring in disabled users to help us test that. And so you want to look for that human testing part of that. But again, it doesn't have to be disabled persons. You can usually, as an add-on for audits, ask that the agency do testing with actual disabled users. This usually adds quite a bit of cost to the audit. Even if your site is not very large, doing an audit on all the pages of your website could get expensive very quickly. So typically what's offered is what's called a sampling audit. And that's generally a lot more affordable. So a sampling audit looks at a limited number of pages on your website. Our most common sampling audit service looks at 10 pages, and then you have to extrapolate from that report. So if you have a specific issue on some of those 10 pages, you probably have it on more pages of your site too. So you need to go out. If you really want a report that's going to detail every single issue on your site so that you can have somebody go in and fix it, that's going to be a much higher cost product, but more affordable is doing a sampling and then extrapolating from there. So typically you might hire a specialty agency to do an accessibility audit, and then you would take that report back to your regular developers to get remediation work done. You can't, I mean, we do remediation work too, but typically we're working with alongside folks, like Colin and minimize clients, right? We do the audit, but then folks get a report of that and then hire their regular developer to take on the remediation work that needs to be done. Because you really want to have that person on board with you. You want to make sure they understand what's there. You want to make sure that they understand the changes that were done so that they can help support you along the way in keeping your website accessible over the long run. We usually encourage site owners to deal with most of the what we call the low-hanging fruit, or the obvious accessibility issues like alt text and proper heading structure and all that before having an audit done. That means that the person who's performing the audit is more able to focus on more other issues that might not have been as obvious. But an audit can be done at any time, and some clients, like governmental agencies or educational institutions that have very clear legal mandates for accessibility and often have more than just a couple of people working on content, those sites usually have regular annual or even semi-annual audits done to make sure that they are staying accessible. So we're kind of nearing the end. I just want to put out there, I'm grateful to Colin and to Minimize for creating this opportunity for me to share a little bit of knowledge with you today. And if you're interested in having an audit done of your site, as Colin mentioned at the beginning, we've done some audits for Minimize clients. I'm offering a Minimize clients $250 off a 10-page sampling on it. No expiration on that. If at some point in the future you're interested in having an audit done, you can just let us know if that's of interest to you. But I'm not, as Colin knows, a heavy-handed salesperson. But accessibility is the right thing to do. There's a moral argument, but it does make business sense too. And I hope you've found some nuggets to take away with you there. So Thanks for listening.
Wow, thank you. That's so informative, and I love all the information you brought here today. Your graphics really support everything, and boy, I learned some stuff too. Bet and I have been working together for a few months now, and I just keep learning, and even today, lots of things. So
Well, and I think that actually that's a really important point, and that is there's a fire hose of stuff, and sometimes that can feel overwhelming, and it keeps you from starting. But once you start, it it's a continue. I keep learning new things about accessibility. You're always going to keep learning new things about accessibility, and we need to talk about. There's a saying in the among the website accessibility professionals: progress, not perfection. Right? No website will ever be 100% compliant because there are just too many variables and edge cases and people who have comorbid or multiple disabilities. There's just no way. And so you really want to keep making progress, but know that it will never be perfect.
that's a great point. I totally agree, because I think a lot of fear in trying to make a website accessible is like, oh crap, I got to do 1,000 things. How am I ever going to do all that stuff? And so
Yeah.
that's a great point. The point is, look, don't try to do it all, but just get started. Just make some efforts, and you don't have to do it all at once. You can do it progressively, but just start to dip your toes in the water and like start to make moves in that direction.
And that's a
So,
part of our accessibility reports, is also like just trying to say, you probably want to start here and do these things first, and then these things can come later, do this next, and then, right, so that can
mhm,
help too, right? Kind of organize what's the most important to start on, and
great.
what are the things that are easy for content managers or people that are doing their own content to do, and then what do you need help from a developer for? Because
Mhm.
some of both, right?
Okay, great. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'm gonna go quickly scan through the chat window. Thankfully, there haven't been a whole lot of questions, but I will kind of
Oh no, I love
just
questions.
read these off a little bit one at a time, and then maybe after we go through these questions, we could just open the floor to anybody who wants to turn the mute off and jump in.
Sure.
This is a question that I put in there on the alt text, and maybe you're not sure the answer is. A lot of people are saying, okay, I'm ready to put my alt text in. Do you have to say in the text, do you have to say image of
No,
a
you
baby
don't want
holding
to
a,
say that.
a flower?
No, you never want to say image of or picture of, because the screen reader announces that it's an image first. So that's a
Ah,
redundancy then, right?
so you
So
just jump right in to say, person holding a flower.
yeah, exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And if you have alt text, there are some tools, there are some plugins that will try and help you look for where you're missing alt text in your site. So there's some tools like that. You want to be, there are some tools that also will use AI to try and generate an alt text, but you really want to look carefully at what it generates, because it's AI and it can be really like we had one that was a picture on a client site of what I assume was a dad and a elementary school kid on the beach. But the alt text that the AI generated was people wearing scary masks, and I was like,
Oh gosh,
what?
that's why you do it manually.
Yeah.
Quick question. Next question. What type of companies do you recommend having their site be ADA accessible for?
Mm.
Meaning, wineries, public jurisdictions, private companies that sell to consumers, or those who offer professional services, like a
Yep.
lot of minimized
Yep.
clients. What type of companies do you see here about being sued, or is it mainly just wineries and clothing stores or whatnot? So
Yeah.
is it industry? Are there? I guess my sense here is like, what's the hot point on the lawsuits
Yeah.
right now?
So legally, what we're seeing is, theoretically, if you're doing anything related to the public, if you're not a nonprofit, right? Legally, potentially you're at risk. But the lawsuits, of course, are starting with what they assume will be the easiest to prove, and basically they'll work their way back down. So we see, like last year, about 75% of those ADA lawsuits were for e-commerce sites. Then you clearly, government websites, higher education, all education pieces, those all have clear mandates that are requirements. And you hear about some of those too, people suing the city or the county or the whatever. And then anything that gets, and then any kind of public service. So your bank, your utility company, those kind of pieces, those all have to be compliant. You get some lawsuits there. And then you start moving back down into things that are interactions on the website. So things like, Domino's Pizza, the guy couldn't order a pizza online, right? So ordering things, any interactions. And then we move down. So in the grand scheme of things, I would say the risk is smaller for professional services firms at this moment, but not zero, because all it takes is just one person, right? And we've had a construction company get a demand letter, right? So
Mhm.
uh, it's
We
just
build
kind of a
websites for
whim.
construction companies.
Yeah. So it's a it's a crapshoot, right? Are you highly likely? Probably not, but there's still some, and I would say it's coming. They'll work their way down, and you probably want to start getting ready, right? And I'll just say, when you didn't ask this, but I'll put this out there because I think it's helpful for people to think about. If you're feeling okay about your current site, or you're going to start looking at the content of it, perhaps, right? For now, there is a kind of a tipping point when we look at websites, and that is if your site has uh, so in WordPress, there are theme related issues. There's like the design and the control of the layouts and things. And there are content related issues. And if your site has more than a few theme related issues, and at least some content issues, which are more typical, right, are very typical. If you're more than, website design typically lasts 3 to 5 years, maybe 6 if you're lucky, right? If you're more than halfway through that point, it's probably more cost effective for you to simply bump up your next redesign project, make sure that it's accessible, than it is to try and invest a lot of money trying to make this thing accessible, because then you're kind of tacking a bunch of stuff on. It's harder to do. It's harder to find everything and make it accessible, and then turn around in another 3 years and spend out for a whole new project, right? So there's a tipping point in there where it's more cost effective simply to bump up a new redesign project.
Yes, yes, great analogy. Especially at these times. Sometimes cheaper to buy a new car than it is to buy a used car and
Well,
have
there's
to
a
fix
tipping
it up
point
so they
with your
can.
car, right? Yeah, exactly. That's a great
Right.
analogy, right? There's a tipping
Yes.
point at which things start to start falling
Yeah.
apart
It
on the
needs a new
car, and you
transmission.
just,
And the car is 20 years old. I'm like, screw it. I'm just going to go buy a new car.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
That's a good point.
Oh, yeah, other
A
questions?
couple more questions, real quickly. We've got about 5 more minutes left.
Oh, we can
I
go over
think
a little.
one of
I'm
these is
I'm
relate.
happy to go over a little bit if people want to hang out still, but yeah.
Oh, great.
All right.
I think this is related to the code side of things. Does semantic markup involve changing how things are coded on the back end of the site, or does it mean adding labels such as H1, H2, etc., to the headings that show up on the front end of the website? So I think
So
this is just a code.
yeah,
A code.
yeah. So when you're working in WordPress and you have a block open and you say this is H2, it's putting the H tags on there for you, right? So it's code, but it's not you putting in those tags, right? You're putting those in by telling the block this is an H2 block or this is an H3 block. There are some of those things that are labels for semantic markup that are in the content editor, right? This is why, our agency can build a new website. We can make it just about as compliant as it can get. And then the second that somebody goes in to change any content on that site, it can go out of compliance because now somebody's put in something and didn't put the H tags in the right way or didn't put alt text on an image. So that's why you see these sites have legal requirements doing audits all the time, because they know that things can get out of compliance, right? So I'm not sure if I answered that question, but there are theme related things that the theme can make your site inaccessible because the theme is also applying code labels to different parts of your site, right? It has to label the sidebar correctly as a sidebar in the code, right? But if it didn't do that properly, then you're out of compliance, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's one that it really would kind of get into the nitty gritty of the way that specific website has been coded. Because you're right, in WordPress you can create what's called a WYSIWYG field that Beth was just describing, a field in which the editor can add H tags or paragraph text or images. It's just a big kind of a blank slate where the editor can put in whatever they want to. A lot of times for Minimize, we actually try to reduce the use of those because we want to be very careful about applying certain styles. And so a lot of times we have text fields that don't give you that ability, and that's done on purpose so that the front end of the website looks consistent.
Yep.
Instead of having multiple editors coming in and editing a page that looks all jumbled and the hierarchy is all screwed up, we actually try to take those away. So in that case, it falls back on adjusting the theme code to be more compliant if it wasn't built that way, to add the H tags properly and wrap them around the text that you're typing into that limited field.
We do the same thing. We talk about putting the bowler bumper pads in, right?
Yes,
bowling,
that's a great analogy.
like we're trying to keep people out of the gutters by limiting some of the choices in the editor. Yeah,
that's a great analogy. A couple more quick questions. Those are the main ones. A question I had, and maybe you're not the right person to answer this, but the tax credit, really a great resource. Do you know if that is a one-time thing, or is it something that you can do like every year?
Single year.
Wow, what a great benefit.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, you can get a new site built this year and make sure that accessibility is a part of it, and put that whole, up to $10,000, right? So if the cost of it, you get, but that's a pretty significant chunk, half of $10,000, and then as a credit. And then, the next year you can come back and you can have an audit done, and then you can have remedial,
That's, wow,
I mean,
that is a great resource.
I think is that eventually you run out of things that you can do, right?
Yes.
But, you could have an annual audit done if you're having changes made to the site over the year. Yeah.
Oh, an annual, that'd be great. Yeah, every year you go in and just kind of get it closer and closer and closer.
Yeah, that water district is still our client. We do a semi-annual audit for them because
great.
It's a huge if there are government sites that are not compliant, and water in California is a little litigious and messy anyway politically, and so they are worried about somebody trying to pin them on accessibility when they really have other agendas and so forth.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that's going to cover it. Does anyone else, we're open the floor here. We're running a little bit, we're right on time actually, but if anybody else has any questions, feel free to just unmute yourself and shout out.
Yeah.
We're down to just a few more folks here. So Megan, Leslie, Kristen, do you have anything you want to ask the expert while she's here? No. Crickets.
Not.
Well, I can say this was just such a great idea, Bet. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to walk through it all.
That's cool. I just love
it's just a wonderful resource.
People learn more about it. So yeah, and if questions come up later, don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay.
Cool.
That's great. Yeah. And I don't know.
Thanks for putting this all together, Colin.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's great, my pleasure. And again, first time doing a webinar, we did it. Nobody got kicked off. Everything's cool. So we did it as a team.
Bombed. You didn't get Zoom.
That's right. Nobody photobombed it. Well, it's not too late. We could do it. Well, great. So again, thank you so much for your time, and we will follow up with any questions or anything that comes along. So
that's great. Everybody have a great rest
of your day. Very grateful. You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.